The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like machinery counting down to something none of them could see. Oak Creek Memorial's trauma unit hummed with that particular rhythm of controlled urgency, ventilators cycling, monitors beeping their algorithmic pulse, the soft pneumatic wheeze of pneumatic doors opening and closing to the rhythm of human crisis. The smell of antiseptic hung beneath something else, fear, blood, the copper and salt undertone that nobody who'd worked healthcare for long could ever quite ignore. Cold stainless steel gleamed under harsh white light, waiting to be used. Rachel Torres arrived at 10:41 p.m. wearing scrubs the color of faded denim and shoes with the tread worn down on the right heel. She moved through the double doors of the overnight shift change like water finding the lowest available space, present but undemanding. Her badge hung from a lanyard with her name printed in the kind of font that suggested temporary status, Rachel Torres, contract RN, expires in 6 months. The other nurses, the permanent ones, the ones who attended the holiday parties and knew each other's children's names, glanced up as she passed, registered her presence as a form of absence, and went back to their charting. This was intentional. Rachel had spent years learning how to occupy a room without actually occupying it. She settled into the shift briefing beside Derek Martinez, who'd been running the trauma unit day shifts for 4 years and who had that particular gift of never quite meeting your eyes when he spoke. 2 gunshot wounds in 3 and 4, both stable for now. MVA in 5 with a femur fracture waiting on orthopedic consultation. Bed 7 is that Marine they brought in from the training accident down at Camp Pendleton. 19 years old, compound fracture of the left fibula and tibia, some soft tissue damage, but his vitals stable and resting. His mother was here until 20 minutes ago. Should be quiet tonight. Rachel nodded, writing the information on her assignment sheet in handwriting that was precise but small, the kind of handwriting that suggested someone had learned early not to take up too much visual space. Anything else? The usual, Derek said, and she heard the subtext in those 2 words, don't ask too many questions. Don't stay after your shift. Don't take up oxygen. Dr. Sterling swept through the unit at 11:13 p.m. wearing dress pants under his scrubs, which meant he'd come from somewhere important, somewhere that mattered. He was tall in the way that seemed to compress the ceiling, and his eyes moved across the staff with the appraising quality of a man checking inventory. When his gaze landed on Rachel, it paused. Hesitated. She felt it the way prey feels surveillance, not as a threat yet, but as a tension, which was often worse. She moved to bed 7 to begin her assessment rounds, pulling the chart as she walked. The Marine's file was thin, which meant the accident had happened this afternoon, a Humvee rollover during a combat readiness exercise, extraction by base medical, transferred to Oak Creek because Naval Hospital San Diego was at capacity. Name was listed as First Lieutenant Jonathan Halloway, though his bracelet read Private Halloway with yesterday's date. Promotion orders hadn't been updated yet, probably. The chart noted he was 19. Rachel did the math without thinking about doing it, that meant he'd been born in 2005. She'd been in Helmand Province in 2005. The young man was asleep when she entered the room, his left leg elevated in a sequential compression device, the kind that rhythmically inflated and deflated to prevent clotting. His face was the face of someone who'd been trained to look at terrible things without flinching, which at 19 meant he hadn't yet learned what terrible things actually looked like. Rachel checked his 4, verified the rate, confirmed the label on the saline bag matched the order. She felt his pulse at the radial artery, strong, steady, the pulse of someone whose body had decided to rest. Everything by protocol. Everything invisible. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something. The chart listed a tattoo on his right shoulder blade, coordinates and a date. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. Her own shoulder blade carried coordinates and a date in the same location, though hers was sewn into the lining of a jacket she kept at the bottom of her locker, a faded unit patch the color of old sand, the kind of thing that explained nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it meant. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial was decorated in what Rachel thought of as late hospital institutional, a refrigerator humming in one corner, a microwave that smelled like reheated fish, a laminate table with chairs that didn't quite sit flat. She sat alone at 12:38 a.m. with her lunch in a plastic container, rice, beans, chicken from yesterday, The kind of meal that took 40 seconds to prepare and provided exactly the calories necessary to keep functioning. The kind of meal you ate because you had to, not because eating involved anything as complicated as pleasure. She'd been sitting for 90 seconds when she heard footsteps, the sound of the door opening, and then the particular silence that fell when someone realized the break room was occupied. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway for a moment, her expression moving through stages: recognition, acknowledgement, correction. She turned and left without sitting down, without explanation. This had happened before, in different variations. Sometimes it was on the first day. Sometimes people lasted longer before they noticed that sitting with Rachel required a social investment they'd rather not make. Rachel ate her beans. The microwave hummed. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor was alarming, a distant sound, not hers yet, someone else's crisis happening at exactly the same velocity as everyone else's crisis. She'd lived in this exact place, this space between attention and invisibility, for a long time now. It was quiet here. It was survivable. The double doors of the trauma unit opened at 1:06 a.m. with the sound of an incoming ambulance, and she stood on reflex, moving toward the control station where Derek was already updating the board. Another patient. Another crisis. Rachel set her container in the refrigerator. It would stay there for 3 days before someone threw it out, and moved toward Bedford where the paramedics were transferring a 67-year-old man with chest pain and a blood pressure that looked like it was falling as they moved him. She assessed him the way she assessed all patients, methodically, competently, with a kind of attention that caught things. His troponin levels were borderline. His EKG showed subtle changes in the ST segment that the monitor wasn't flagging, but that her eyes, trained through years of looking at soldiers on the worst day of their lives, caught immediately. She made a note. She mentioned it to Derek. He acknowledged it in that way people acknowledge things from people who don't matter, with the minimum amount of verbal affirmation, moving quickly to something else. Dr. Sterling appeared beside her at 1:22 a.m., moving with the kind of silence that suggested he was used to appearing in places unannounced, used to people being ready for him before he arrived. "Ms. Torres," he said, and the way he said it suggested the name was a joke they both understood, though she was the only one laughing inside her own skull. "How long have you been working in nursing?" She didn't look up from the vitals she was recording. 12 years, she said. The truth, just not the whole truth. "And before that?" "Different work," she said. "Still true." Dr. Sterling's silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Then, I'd like you to focus on bed 7 this shift." The Marine. His mother seemed concerned about the level of attention he was receiving during the day. "Personal touch, you understand?" Rachel nodded. She understood a lot of things. She understood that being asked to do something by Dr. Sterling was a form of being tested. She understood that attention in a hospital could be dangerous, that being seen was different from being invisible, and that those differences mattered in ways that were hard to explain to people who'd never had to disappear. The Marine woke at 2:13 a.m., thirsty and restless. Rachel brought him water, helped him drink from a cup with a bendy straw, checked his pain levels. He was on moderate doses of morphine, but pain was information. She could see it in the way his breathing changed, the way his eyes tracked toward his injured leg when he thought nobody was watching. She adjusted his foredrip, noting everything on his chart. Professional. Competent. Thorough. "What's your name?" he asked as she was leaving. "Rachel," she said. "Just the first name." "Just the surface." "Rachel," he repeated, and something in his voice suggested he was testing it, the way people test words to see if they fit. "That's a good name." "Solid." "You're different from the day nurses. You actually look at people." She didn't respond to this. Responding meant engagement, and engagement meant questions, and questions led to places where people started asking who you actually were. Instead, she said, "Get some rest, Private Holloway. Your body needs it." "Soon to be lieutenant," he said, and she heard the pride there, the absolute certainty of a 19-year-old who believed that the future was something that would definitely arrive. Rachel made sure he was comfortable and left him to sleep, moving back into the rhythm of the night shift, monitoring, assessing, documenting, being present in the way that meant nobody would notice her presence. This was the work she'd come here to do. This was the anonymity she'd purchased with years of silence. But somewhere in the building, Dr. Sterling was reviewing supply orders that didn't quite add up. He was noting discrepancies in medication counts. He was watching a temporary nurse who moved through his unit with the precision of someone trained in crisis, and he was beginning to wonder whether Rachel Torres was exactly who her paperwork said she was, and whether her presence might be a problem that required solving. The night shift hummed on, moment by moment, toward something none of them could see coming. The night shift hummed on, moment by moment, toward something none of them could see coming. Rachel moved through the hallway at 11:38 p.m. with medication trays balanced across her forearms, her movements economical, almost choreographed. The fluorescent panels above cast everything in institutional white. She had been at Oak Creek Memorial for 5 months now, and in those 5 months she had learned the precise rhythm of invisibility: arrive, work, disappear. The other nurses didn't invite her to break room conversations. She didn't ask why. Dr. Sterling was waiting near the trauma bay when the gunshot victim arrived at 11:52 p.m. 32 years old, legacy hospital family, the kind of surgeon whose arrogance had been polished into institutional authority over decades. He stood in a white coat that probably cost more than Rachel's car, watching the paramedics wheel in a patient with a wound to the left anterior thorax. The family followed, mother, teenage daughter, uncle, their voices sharp with terror. Rachel was already there, already assessing, her eyes moving across the monitor readouts with the kind of systematic efficiency that made nurses twice her seniority look lazy. Sterling began barking orders, and Rachel moved to the crash cart. She grabbed an 18-gauge angiocath and began setting up for rapid infusion, her hands already knowing what came next. The monitor showed a tension pneumothorax building. The patient's O2 sat was falling. 94, 89. 82. She caught Sterling's eyes and saw him register what she was doing, saw him register that she'd noticed something he hadn't yet noticed. His jaw tightened. His face went blank in that particular way men's faces go blank when a woman has just made them look slow. The family was watching everything. The mother had her phone out, filming. Sterling turned to Rachel with the kind of smile that comes right before a knife slides in. Temp nurse. You think you know better than the attending physician. His voice carried across the bay, loud enough for everyone to hear. Your triage decision putting this patient on standard monitoring instead of immediate chest tube placement is reckless. Dangerous. You put this family's son at risk because you don't understand chain of command. The room had gone very still. The monitor beeped its steady alarm. Rachel's hands didn't falter. She was already prepping the needle decompression kit, already moving to the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She had done this 1,000 times. Literally 1,000 times. But she didn't say that. She said nothing at all. She just worked. Did you hear me? Sterling's voice had taken on the tone of a man being deliberately ignored, and it infuriated him. I'm speaking to you. You don't get to ignore the attending physician. Not in my trauma unit. Rachel's eyes flickered toward him for one moment. Just one. Then back to her hands. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping from the pleural space made everyone in the room flinch except her. The patient's oxygen saturation began to climb. 85, 88. 91, the mother's hand went to her mouth. You overstepped. Sterling's voice had taken on the edge of someone whose authority had just been publicly validated by the patient's body. You made an assumption about my orders. You made a medical judgment call that wasn't yours to make. We'll be discussing this formally. Rachel nodded once. The kind of nod that cost her nothing and gave him the satisfaction of appearing to have won something. The family was staring at her now with the kind of gratitude that made Sterling's presence in the room seem suddenly small. She could feel it. She knew he could feel it too. The break room became a study in choreography after that. Rachel learned the pattern quickly. She would sit at the small table near the window with whatever cold lunch she had brought, usually something she could eat in 7 minutes so the interruption would be brief. The first time it happened, 3 nurses who had been discussing a patient case stood up almost simultaneously and left. She had thought it was coincidence. The second time, it was 5 nurses. By the 4th time, it was everyone. The room would empty as if she had brought a contagion. She learned to time her breaks for when the unit was dense with emergencies, when fewer staff members would be there to leave. What she didn't understand initially was that Sterling had made a phone call. She found this out by accident when she overheard him in his office talking to someone she later learned was the chief nursing officer, the temp contract nurse. Torres. She's been undermining my authority, making unilateral calls, talking down to staff. I need her isolated until her contract expires. Make sure people understand that associating with her reflects poorly on them. It was brutally efficient. He hadn't had to threaten anyone. He had simply positioned association with her as a career liability, and the herd had moved accordingly. Rachel watched it happen with the kind of clinical distance she applied to everything else. This was how power worked. This was how systems protected themselves. The written warning appeared on the staff bulletin board at 2:06 a.m. on a Tuesday, printed on hospital letterhead and signed by Dr. Sterling and the nurse supervisor. Rachel stood in front of it while restocking the medication cart, reading the formal language, failure to follow chain of command. Insubordination. Inappropriate assumption of medical authority. Unprofessional conduct. There was her name. Rachel Torres. Contracted temporary staff. The words were careful. Legal. Built to stick. Sterling had created a paper trail that would make her employment history toxic. No other hospital would touch her if this contract ended poorly. She understood that immediately. She understood that he understood that. She understood that everyone reading the bulletin board understood that. She was still standing there when Dr. Sterling rounded the corner. He stopped when he saw her reading her own indictment. His eyes moved across her face, searching for something, a crack, a flinch, a moment of breakdown. He was waiting for her to crumble. She could see it in his posture, in the way he tilted his head slightly, as if he was listening for her breathing to become ragged. Rachel turned to look at him. She let one tear escape, singular and deliberate, and then she wiped it away with the back of her hand. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't look away. She met his eyes the entire time she raised her hand to her face, the entire time she removed the evidence of emotion. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady like a metronomic pulse. I've seen what real authority looks like, Dr. Sterling. This isn't it. The words hung in the hallway. Around them, the hospital continued its midnight rhythm, ventilators wheezed, monitors beeped, the ice machine clattered in the break room. But in that small radius where they stood, the air had changed. He had built an entire apparatus to break her, and she had looked at that apparatus and found it small. His face flushed. His hand moved toward the bulletin board as if he might rip it down, then stopped. He turned and walked away without another word, his shoes clicking against the tile with the irregular pace of someone who was no longer certain of his footing. Rachel returned to her medication cart. She continued her work with the same measured precision she brought to everything. 2 nurses watched her from across the unit, their eyes tracking her, recalibrating something in their understanding of her. She didn't acknowledge them. She didn't need to. But that was the moment everything tilted. That was the moment someone in the hospital, one of the younger residents, Dr. Keegan, who had watched the entire scene from the corner, began to pay attention. He had noticed her hands during the pneumothorax procedure. The way they moved. The way they knew things before they happened. The way she'd responded to Sterling's humiliation with a composure that wasn't defensive but almost command-level calm. He had seen plenty of nurses. He had never seen a nurse move like she had, something written into her muscle memory that went deeper than civilian training could go. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But he began to watch. At 2:22 a.m., the emergency line lit up with an incoming trauma alert. Standoff situation in Southeast San Diego. Gunshot wound, 1 suspect, 1 victim, police on scene, ETA 4 minutes. The unit went into surge mode. Rachel was already moving, her hands already preparing beds, already arranging equipment with the kind of systematic speed that made everyone else look like they were moving underwater. Sterling appeared in the doorway of the trauma bay, his authority restored by the promise of crisis, the written warning already fading into background noise in the face of active emergency. The patient came through the doors at 2:26 a.m., mid-30s, abdominal trauma, entry wound left lower quadrant, possible hepatic artery involvement. Blood on the stretcher. Blood on his clothes. Blood that smelled like copper and something else, something that made the electrical system in Rachel's nervous system fire in a pattern it hadn't fired in 6 years. Mortar fire. The smell wasn't copper. It was dust and burning rubber and the sweet metal smell of blood in a place where blood had no business being. It was Helmand Province. It was a collapsed school building with a 9-year-old underneath the rubble, calling in a voice like a bird's call, thin and panicked. It was her hands finding the child's hand first, was Rachel pulling, the whole building seeming to shift, was dust in her mouth, her eyes, dust that tasted like concrete and something else, something she would taste for the rest of her life. She blinked. The dust was gone. The hospital bay resolved around her. The monitor was beeping. Dr. Sterling was barking orders that didn't make sense, that were tactically unsound. The patient's pressure was dropping. 118/64. 110/58. 98/52. The wound was bleeding faster than they were replacing volume. This was a losing game unless someone made the right call in the next 90 seconds. Muscle memory took over. Rachel moved toward the crash cart with her hands already moving, already gathering what came next. A 14-gauge needle. The groin. The femoral artery access point where you could clamp if the hepatic bleed was too massive to repair in standard surgical time. Where you could buy minutes by cutting off distal perfusion. It wasn't standard protocol for this unit. It was field medicine. It was what you did when you were miles from a surgical theater and someone was dying. She said nothing. She simply began to move toward the patient's groin, her hands already knowing the anatomical landmarks, her fingers already finding the pulse point. Stop. Dr. Sterling's voice cut across the bay. That's not protocol. Step back from the patient. But Rachel was already prepping the site. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were tracking the monitor. She could see the numbers falling like a countdown to something inevitable. The patient had 90 seconds, maybe less. Sterling had no idea what was about to happen because Sterling had never stood in a field hospital watching blood transfusions run dry, never learned the mathematics of triage when your options were all forms of losing differently. I said step back. Sterling moved toward her, his hand reaching for her arm. That was when the monitor flatlined. The alarm shrieked. Everything in the unit paused for exactly 1 heartbeat, and then every person in the room understood they were watching a human being die in real time, and Rachel's hands moved toward the patient's chest because that was what came next, because you didn't stop moving just because the math looked impossible, because. Dr. Sterling grabbed her wrist. Pulled her back. His face was red. His voice was a roar. Get away from my patient. The flatline continued its electronic wailing. The patient's pupils were fixed. The monitor showed the unforgiving straight line of a rhythm that wasn't coming back on its own. And in that moment, with her wrist in Sterling's grip, with her hands pulled away from someone who was dying, Rachel felt something shift in her chest. Not fear. Not hesitation. Something colder. Something that recognized this moment as the one where she would have to choose between staying invisible and staying alive. She was still standing there, her hand hanging in the space where the patient's chest had been, when the code team burst through the double doors. The explosion came at 2:27 a.m. A gas line rupture in the East Wing basement, a spark somewhere in the dark, and then the world folded in on itself. The blast shattered windows 3 floors up and knocked the backup generator offline. Alarm screamed. Fire suppression systems wailed like wounded animals. Smoke rolled through the corridors in thick grey waves, stinking of burning insulation and melted plastic, and suddenly Oak Creek Memorial wasn't a hospital anymore, it was a combat zone. Patients screaming. Monitors screaming. The ventilators wheeling themselves into silence as power drained from the walls like blood from a vein. Rachel was in the break room, sitting alone with her sad desk lunch like she did most nights, when the building lurched. She didn't flinch. 20 years of IED training had taught her that the safest response to an explosion was to stay still for exactly 3 seconds, assess, then move. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3. She was on her feet before the dust settled, before the emergency lighting flickered to life, before the overhead intercom crackled with the kind of terror that usually took years to develop. Code red. East Wing. All available staff report to trauma bays. This is not a drill. Dr. Sterling was in bed 7 when the blast hit. Not physically in the bed, he'd been standing there conducting his usual rounds, clipboard under his arm like a scepter, when the floor jolted beneath him. The young Marine with a tattoo on his left shoulder, the 19-year-old who'd been recovering from his training accident for the past 6 weeks, was connected to 3 different monitors. Oxygen saturation 96. Heart rate 68. Blood pressure stable at 112/71. The kind of patient who looked fine until something changed faster than the human eye could track. The explosion changed things faster than that. The power cut to the main monitor. Sterling's face went the color of old concrete. He'd frozen in the doorway, actually frozen, feet rooted, shoulders locked, watching the young Marine's chest. Watching it rise. Watching it stop rising. The kid's O2 sat dropping in real time, and Sterling was just standing there, clipboard forgotten, mouth open like a door that wouldn't close. His lung, Sterling whispered. Not a command. Not even a question. Just a man watching his institution collapse around him and not knowing what to do about it. Rachel was already moving. She took the corner at speed, felt her shoe stick slightly to the hospital tile, something wet there, probably water from the sprinkler system, and her muscle memory catalogued that data without asking her permission. The hallway was chaos, staff running toward the fire exits, nurses pulling patients from rooms, and she moved through it like a current through chaos. Against the flow. Always against the flow. Room 7, she called out. I need a 14-gauge needle. A resident looked up from a crash cart, confused. The backup power's offline. We need to. I said I need a needle. Now. The voice wasn't a request. It wasn't even quite a voice anymore, it was something lower and colder, coming from a place in her chest that hadn't been awake in 6 months. The resident found the needle without asking why. That's what you do when someone speaks like that. You obey. She pushed Sterling aside. Not hard, just the way you move someone who's frozen, the way you handle an obstacle. His eyes tracked her like she was a stranger, which technically she was. Just a contract nurse. Just the temp everyone ignored. Just a woman who'd never shown any sign of being anything more than that. His eyes tracked her and didn't understand what they were seeing. The Marine's chest was barely rising now. 68, 64. 62, his O2 sat plummeting because the pneumothorax, the collapsed lung, was pressing on his heart. Every breath he took pulled air into the space between his lung and his ribs. The pressure building. The lung collapsing. The heart beginning to think about stopping. She found the spot without hesitation. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers located the landmarks the way a violinist finds the right strings, by feel, by knowledge that lived in the bone. She prepped the site with a betadine swab, her movements mechanical and precise, and Sterling was trying to say something behind her. Trying to move. Trying to remember that he was a doctor and therefore he should be the one doing this. He should have been faster. The needle went in. 14-gauge catheter sliding through skin, through fascia, into that deadly space where the lung had collapsed. And then. The hiss. Air escaping. The sound of pressure releasing, of equilibrium returning, of a problem solving itself in the space of a heartbeat. The young Marine gasped. His chest rose. Rose again. Kept rising. "Get me an oxygen mask," Rachel said. She didn't look at Sterling. Didn't look at anyone. Non-rebreather. High flow. "And somebody find me a manual blood pressure cuff because the electronics are down and we need baseline vitals." Boots on tile. Multiple sets, running. The kind of automatic obedience that happens when someone speaks with the authority of someone who spent the last 20 years giving orders in places where the wrong command got people killed. Her hands were steady as she secured the needle, as she taped it down, as she positioned the young Marine on his side to keep the airway clear. The O2 sat climbed. 68, 72, 79, 85, 88, 92. Stable. The heart rate returning to normal, 65 now, 68, finally settling at 70. The thing that had been dying 3 minutes ago was breathing again, and it was breathing because of her. A nurse, someone younger, someone who'd been an intern when Rachel arrived, handed her the oxygen mask with shaking hands. How did you? Evacuation protocol, Rachel said. Her voice was already shifting back toward something quieter, but it was too late. The basement of the hospital had already heard the real thing underneath. "I need the rest of the east wing cleared. Patients mobile enough to walk go to the west corridor. Everyone else gets wheeled out. Anyone who can't be moved gets stabilized here. What's the fire suppression status?" I'll check with." "Check now." The young woman ran. Sterling was still frozen in the doorway, but his expression had changed. The administrative confidence had drained out of it, replaced by something that looked like confusion. Recognition. The first whisper of understanding that the temp nurse in the oversized scrubs had just done something that required knowledge beyond the scope of a temporary contract position. The young Marine's eyes were open now, looking up at her. Dark brown eyes. Eyes that seemed to recognize something in return, the way animals sometimes do when they sense the presence of something predatory. Not threatening. Just aware. A creature looking at another creature that had traveled the same roads through the same dark. Rachel met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to the monitors. She was adjusting the oxygen flow when she noticed it. The sleeve of the Marine's hospital gown had pulled up, and there it was. A tattoo on the inside of his left arm. Letters and numbers. A designation. A unit marker that she recognized the way you recognize your own name spoken in a language you'd been trying to forget. She kept her hands moving. Kept her voice level. The room was still full of smoke and chaos and people trying to remember what they were supposed to be doing, and none of them were looking at her closely enough to see the very small fracture that had appeared at the edge of her composure. The evacuation took 17 minutes. The fire department arrived in 13. By the time the smoke had cleared enough to breathe without a mask, Rachel had already moved on, helping evacuate trauma patients, assisting with triage in the West Wing, giving orders that people followed without questioning. She'd been a combat medic for 4 tours in Helmand Province. She'd done this before. She knew how to move through catastrophe like it was water. What she hadn't known was that the 19-year-old in bed 7 had been pulled from a burning Humvee in Jalabad 20 years ago. She hadn't known that his eyes had been watching her face as she saved his life. She hadn't known that somewhere in his memory, in the place where he stored the faces of the people who'd kept him alive when everything was burning, he'd just seen a ghost. And that ghost had just changed everything. The monitor showed sinus rhythm. The room went dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. The young Marine's chest rose and fell on his own now, oxygen saturation climbing steadily past 90%, and Rachel stood motionless at the bedside with her gloved hand still positioned above his sternum, the needle decompression complete, the tension pneumothorax released, the pressure no longer crushing his lungs. His eyes fluttered open. He tried to speak. She pulled her hand back before he could reach for her wrist, before recognition could form in his pupils, and she turned away. Wrong patient. The words died unspoken. She had maybe 90 seconds before Dr. Sterling realized what she'd just done, that she'd bypassed the chain of command, overridden his authority, made a critical intervention without waiting for his signature on the chart. 90 seconds before the consequences found her. They found her in 47. Dr. Sterling materialized in the doorway with his phone already in his hand, his face the color of drywall, and his voice carried across the trauma unit like a statement of law, security. Now. Rachel didn't run. She didn't defend. She simply finished documenting the vital signs into the chart, each keystroke precise, each notation timestamped at 2:51 a.m., and when the two security officers appeared, one with his hand already on his belt, the other texting something into a radio, she was already removing her latex gloves. Unauthorized medical procedures, Sterling said, his words careful, rehearsed. His network had already been activated. She could see it in the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers, the way his jaw clenched around his next words. Falsified credentials. You're done here. You don't touch another patient. You don't speak to another staff member. You clear your locker and you leave this facility. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Rachel nodded once. She'd known this was coming from the moment she'd felt the needle pierce skin, from the moment her hands had moved on muscle memory alone, from the moment she'd made the choice to save a life instead of preserve her cover. Some decisions didn't require deliberation. Some decisions required only surrender. The security officers escorted her downstairs to the employee locker room. Her jacket hung on the hook exactly where she'd left it 3 weeks ago, still damp from the San Diego evening she'd arrived in. She reached for it, felt the weight of the faded Special Forces unit patch sewn inside the lining, the only thing she'd kept when she walked away from everything. The patch was olive drab now, fraying at the edges, the embroidered lettering almost illegible after 20 years. She held it for a moment. Put the jacket on. The locker itself held almost nothing, a half-empty tube of lip balm, 3 granola bars still in their wrappers, a pair of compression socks stuffed into the corner. 3 weeks of a life distilled into 6 square feet of institutional metal. She gathered what little existed. The security officer cleared his throat. We'll need your badge. She unclipped it from her collar. The photo was already outdated, she'd never looked comfortable when the camera caught her. Rachel Torres, temporary nursing staff, printed in Arial 14 point, valid for 6 months. 6 months was all she'd been allowed to exist. She handed it to him. He scanned it. The light turned red. The system locked her out. She was no one again. The parking garage was empty at 3:13 a.m. Her car was a 2014 Honda Civic, grey, forgettable, parked in the back corner where she always left it. She sat in the driver's seat without turning the engine on and held the jacket against her chest. The vinyl felt cold through her scrubs. 3 weeks of groceries paid for in cash. 3 weeks of 12-hour shifts eating lunch alone in her car. 3 weeks of being invisible while the machine of the hospital ground on around her. She'd left her phone in the apartment, no traceable location data, no SIM card registered to anyone real. No calls home because home didn't exist anymore. Her sister's voicemail box was probably full by now. Her mother had stopped calling 2 years ago when Rachel never answered. They'd been told she was working abroad. They'd been told she was fine. They didn't know that fine looked like a temp nursing credential and a jacket with a patch nobody was supposed to see. The rain started at 4:22 a.m. It came in sheets against the windshield, hammering the metal roof of the garage like automatic weapon fire, and Rachel watched it sheet down the glass without moving. The VA hospital was 14 minutes away. She'd walked past it once, 3 weeks ago, during a rare moment when she'd left the apartment without a destination in mind. The sign had read Walter Reed San Diego in brass letters. 27 years since she'd voluntarily filled out an intake form anywhere. 27 years since she'd admitted to anyone that the nightmares had become indistinguishable from memory, that some nights she couldn't separate the faces she'd saved from the faces she hadn't, that the weight of keeping everyone else alive had eventually crushed her ability to keep herself alive. She'd disappeared to heal. She'd failed. She'd taken the first temp nursing job that didn't require a background check and told herself it was temporary, that she was just buying time, that any day now she'd feel ready to re-enter the world as something resembling a person. That day had not arrived. That day wasn't coming. She drove anyway. The waiting room of the VA hospital was pale green and fluorescent lit, filled at 5:06 a.m. with the furniture of institutional care, plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a television mounted in the corner playing a muted news broadcast, and 17 other people scattered throughout the space like artifacts in a museum of broken things. All of them veterans. All of them carrying something invisible. She recognized 3 of them. A Marine she'd treated for severe dehydration in 2018. An Army Ranger with a prosthetic leg who'd spent for hours in her trauma unit waiting for transport to orthopedic surgery. A Navy pilot whose oxygen sat had been 62 when he arrived, and she'd been the one holding the bag valve mask when his lungs finally cooperated with his brain again. None of them looked at her. She was nobody. She sat in a chair between a man whose hand shook and a woman whose eyes wouldn't focus on anything in particular. She pulled the jacket tighter around herself and felt the patch against her ribs. Once she signed the intake forms, she would have a history again. Rachel Torres would exist in a database. Medical records would be generated. A diagnostic code would be assigned, PTSD, chronic, service-related. She would become trackable. She would become real. And once she was real, Dr. Sterling could find her if he wanted to. Once she was real, the woman she'd spent 2 years becoming would finally have to reconcile with the woman she'd been before. The 2 versions of herself would have to meet in a waiting room and acknowledge that neither of them had survived intact. The intake form was 7 pages long. The woman behind the desk was 60-something, grey at the temples, with the kind of eyes that had seen too many versions of this moment. "First time?" she asked. Rachel nodded. "Service branch? Navy? Combat?" "Yes." "Years?" It took Rachel a moment to calculate. "For Torres. 12 years active duty. 17 years since she'd left." The pen shook in her hand as she filled in the dates. Not fear. Not weakness. Restraint. The trembling was her body remembering what her mind had been trying to forget. She finished the form and handed it back. The woman scanned it without reading it, assigned a case number, and scheduled her appointment for Thursday at 2:56 p.m. For days away. For days to sit with the knowledge that someone in the VA system now knew a senior chief petty officer named Rachel Torres had walked through these doors and asked for help. For days until someone's database flag would light up and a phone call would be made somewhere in a government office and the thread she'd cut would suddenly become relevant again. Thunder rolled across the city at 5:44 a.m., distant and low, the kind of sound that made your spine respond before your brain could process it. She sat in the waiting room and watched rain streak the windows. The Marine across from her was crying silently, his hands folded across his lap, his chest moving with a kind of breathing that required conscious effort. A nurse came out and called a name. Someone else stood and left. The waiting room didn't get any less full. It just rotated through its population of damaged people, each of them carrying medals nobody would see and losses nobody could quantify. She was among them now. She was one of them again. And somewhere in the facility, in an office with a desk and a computer terminal, a file was being generated with her real name at the top of it. The file would sit there. It would accumulate notes from intake counselors and psychiatrists and sleep medicine specialists. It would grow a history. And one of these times, when someone ran her name through a clearance database or a criminal background check or any of the 1,000 governmental systems that existed to track people like her, her file would light up red. She heard it before she saw it, the distinctive low thunder of rotors cutting through rain, a sound that existed only at the intersection of memory and reality. A helicopter. Not distant. Not passing overhead. Getting closer. The fluorescent lights in the waiting room flickered once, twice, then steadied. Nobody else seemed to notice. Everyone in the waiting room was locked in their own internal landscape, too focused on their own battles to register the change in air pressure that meant something massive was moving toward the building. Rachel stood without thinking. The jacket was in her hand. She was moving toward the window before her conscious mind caught up with her muscle memory. The rotor wash shook the glass. A Black Hawk. No. 2 Black Hawks. No, 3, their running lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like knives through smoke. They were touching down on the hospital helipad. They were doing it in a formation that meant coordination, that meant someone had made phone calls, had activated protocols, had decided that whatever was happening at this moment required military-grade response and was willing to move resources on zero notice to accomplish it. The intake woman's phone rang. She answered it. Her face changed. She looked up, straight at Rachel. Is there a Rachel in the waiting room? Everything in that moment became very still. The rain continued hammering the windows. The helicopters continued settling into position on the roof. The other veterans in the waiting room gradually became aware that something had shifted, that the air itself had changed pressure, that someone in a green jacket standing alone had just become the center of some invisible calculation. Rachel didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't confirm or deny. The intake woman listened to her phone for another 7 seconds, then hung up. Rachel Torres? They're asking for you. You need to come with me. The Black Hawk rotors were still hammering the San Diego air when the first SEAL rounded the corner of the trauma unit, followed by 7 more in tactical gear, boots announcing themselves against the linoleum with the kind of authority that made nurses step backward. The facility director saw them coming and moved instinctively toward the ICU where Rachel sat alone in a chair outside the Marine's recovery bay, already dressed in civilian clothes, already erased. 2 operators flanked her before she could stand. No words. Just a gesture that meant, come with us. She didn't ask questions. She never did. The convoy that met them on the roof had federal insignia on the doors. An FBI field liaison was waiting with a tablet showing satellite imagery and a classified briefing folder marked Witness Protection Status, Compromised. Rachel's hands remained steady as she read the redacted sections, understanding immediately what had happened. Dr. Sterling had activated his network. Calls to board members. Investigators contacted. References checked. He'd unearthed the falsified credentials within hours, not because he was thorough, but because he was terrified. She'd seen patterns he was skimming. Supply order discrepancies. Phantom billing codes. Roughly $200,000 a year in fraud that a contract nurse reviewing medication logs at 2 a.m. was never supposed to notice. But the facility had an emergency. 20 minutes after Rachel's departure, a former Taliban fighter arrived at Oak Creek Memorial in federal custody, shrapnel wounds deep and septic from a drone strike 72 hours prior. Infection was cascading. Blood pressure dropping. The senior resident called for the attending. Dr. Sterling arrived with his tablet and his certainty that antibiotics would stabilize the situation. They wouldn't. The patient needed surgical intervention within the hour or this became a fatality on Sterling's watch, and fatalities triggered reviews, and reviews exposed patterns. The attending looked at the monitor, then at Sterling, then at the clock. 11 minutes until the next available trauma surgeon was available from Balboa Park. 8 minutes until organ failure became irreversible. The trauma team moved. The resident prepared for emergency thoracotomy. The surgical nurse opened trays. And then the patient's eyes went wide as a nurse passed his gurney in the hallway, and he whispered in Pashto, "E Shaitan al-Ramad." The devil of the sand. The voice that had called coordinates under fire 20 years ago in Helmand province. The hands that had carried him through burning compounds when he was 7 years old and the fighting had turned his neighborhood into an apocalypse. The room went so quiet the monitor sounded like thunder. The patient spoke a name. Not a nurse name. A rank. The young Marine in bed 7 heard it from his recovery bay and his body moved before his mind caught up, standing at attention in a hospital gown, tubes trailing, his voice cracking when he said, "Senior Chief." Security froze. The surgical team froze. And then the doors to the unit burst open and every operator on the roof had been monitoring the internal comms the entire time, descending like a collective exhale of authority that made the walls feel smaller. The SEAL team leader stepped into the operating room and his presence changed the pressure in the air itself. When he spoke, every person in that corridor heard the weight of command, that voice that had directed 16 operations across 3 continents. That is my medic. She outranks everyone in this building. Dr. Sterling's hand was still on the patient's chart. He lowered it. He looked at the operator. He looked at the tattoo visible on the patient's shoulder, a unit insignia that matched the patch on a jacket that had been folded into a locker and forgotten by everyone except the man who'd sewn it there 2 decades ago with thread pulled from a uniform he was never supposed to wear again. The attending was already handing the surgical kit to someone else. The surgical nurse was already stepping back. And Rachel Torres walked past Dr. Sterling in jeans and a borrowed windbreaker, her badge and credentials burned and recreated a dozen times over, and took the position at the operating table as if she'd never left. The patient was already stabilizing before she scrubbed in. Infection needed drainage. Fluid resuscitation. 2 units of O-negative running through lines she threaded with the precision of someone who'd done this under mortar fire. The monitor climbed, 82. 88, 94. Stabilizing. Dr. Sterling tried to speak. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The SEAL leader didn't turn around, but his voice carried, "You just fired her." It wasn't a question. There was an issue with credentials, Sterling stammered. His phone was already buzzing. Calls from the board. Calls from the hospital director. Calls from people who'd been receiving deposits for the last 6 months and were now very suddenly aware that their arrangement was about to become federal evidence. Rachel's hands moved through the procedure, securing lines, monitoring vitals, administering blood products with the muscle memory of someone whose training had never actually left her body, only hibernated. 23 years of service. For Torres. 2 combat zones. Hands that had held lives together in sandstorms and power outages and the kind of darkness that doesn't have a name in English. The FBI liaison appeared in the doorway with 2 other agents and a file folder thicker than a novel. Sterling saw them. His face drained the way old paint peels from wood. The liaison spoke into his radio and suddenly there was a 2-star admiral in dress whites walking into the trauma unit, ribbons across his chest like a map of decisions made in rooms Sterling would never enter, and when that admiral placed a hand on Sterling's shoulder, the entire hospital knew that someone's career was ending before the sun came up. Dr. James Sterling, the admiral said, his voice carrying the weight of discharge papers and terminated contracts and the kind of finality that comes from institutions far larger than any one hospital. You're terminated. Effective immediately. The FBI will be discussing the details of your supply order scheme and your billing practices with the district attorney's office at 8 a.m. 2 agents stepped forward with handcuffs. Sterling tried to protest. The admiral's voice cut through, "You attempted to obstruct medical care." In front of federal agents. In front of a decorated naval officer. That was a mistake. The local news cameras caught every second. The handcuffs clicking. Sterling's face collapsing. The admiral's expression never changing. By the time they escorted him from the building, 17 nurses had witnessed it. By the time the sun rose, every hospital in San Diego knew that Oak Creek Memorial's supply chain had been feeding someone's retirement account, and Dr. Sterling had been careless enough to fire the one person who could prove it. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Sterling in a strip mall off Claremont Drive, sitting at a folding table beside a tax preparation kiosk. The name tag read Steve. He wore khaki pants and a polo shirt with the company logo stitched across the pocket. His hands were shaking as he helped a customer fill out supplemental insurance forms. He flinched when anyone called him doctor. He didn't look up. He didn't make eye contact. He'd moved through the legal system the way men like him always do: plea agreements, community service, a fine that amounted to roughly 3 months of the kickback money, his license suspended for 5 years instead of revoked because his lawyer knew people on the state medical board. But there's a difference between legal escape and actual escape. The nurses at Oak Creek knew his name now. Knew what he'd done. And that knowing, that quiet certainty in the eyes of every medical professional he'd ever work with again, was a sentence no plea deal could reduce. Rachel Torres stood in crisp navy dress blues on the hospital steps 6 months later, dress uniform she hadn't worn since the funeral of her commanding officer in 2019. The hospital board had renamed the trauma unit in her honor. Oak Creek Memorial Trauma Center, Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres Wing. The plaque was bronze. The ceremony was brief. And standing beside her, finally in Lieutenant's bars pinned by her own hands with the kind of care she usually reserved for critical patients, was the Marine from Bed 7. 23 years old now. Recovered. Whole. He'd requested her presence as an official witness for his commission. As the person who'd carried him out of a burning compound and never told him the cost it took, never told him about the PTSD that came with the faces you couldn't save, the weight that sometimes made breathing feel like combat. He stepped forward and he spoke, his voice steady in the way of people who've learned that strength and vulnerability are the same thing wearing different uniforms. He thanked her. Specifically. For the compound in Helmand. For the Humvee recovery. For the hand she'd held when he woke up screaming at 3 in the morning. For choosing to disappear rather than let anyone see how much it cost to save him. For walking into a VA hospital waiting room alone and accepting help from the same people she'd once treated from the other side of the stethoscope. For teaching him that true authority isn't a title or a rank, it's the willingness to stand between chaos and the people you love, and never ask for recognition. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Rachel kept her hands at her sides. She let one tear trace down her face. She wiped it without looking away. And when she spoke, her voice came out like someone who'd learned the difference between power and authority, between commanding a room and knowing when to simply be present in it. Welcome to the service, Lieutenant. The world needs more people like you. The young Marine saluted. The Admiral shook her hand. The nurses from the trauma unit applauded, and somewhere in a strip mall, a man in a polo shirt was helping a customer with an insurance form, and he would never know that the woman whose career he tried to destroy had just become the youngest trauma director in the hospital's history, or that she'd requested that her first official action be the creation of a full pro bono veteran mental health wing, or that the military had already offered her a commission to return to active duty, which she had politely declined with the kind of dignity that makes offers feel more like invitations. She had her answer now. She didn't need medals or authority or uniforms. She needed broken people walking out of her operating room whole. She needed to be the hand that held them together. She needed to be the voice that told them, "You're going to make it." And that needed to happen in scrubs, not in ribbons. In the quiet hours when the fluorescent lights hum and the only witness is the person whose life is being saved. That was enough. That had always been enough. The question isn't whether authorities deserve recognition, it's whether you've ever judged someone based on their appearance, their job, their lack of status, only to discover they were carrying capabilities and sacrifices you never imagined. Have you ever been wrong about someone who seemed ordinary? If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.